All right, well, hello and welcome to our webinar. Let's get started. So today we're talking about Google Analytics migrating to GA4. And as you know, this webinar is brought to you by HEM. And if you're new to HEM, we're a full service digital marketing company that focuses our work on serving educational institutions like yourself. And we serve all types of schools around the world. And we also serve them in multiple languages and support them that way. My name is Paul Masson. I'm the Director of Marketing at HEM, and I'm pleased to introduce our two in-house subject matter experts in this area. We have Philippe Tezat, founder and CEO of HEM, and we have Alex Nahai, our Director of Analytics. So just to let you know, we're going to have your microphones on mute throughout the webinar, and this allows us to cover a lot of ground. And at the end, we're going to answer some of your questions. So please feel free to submit any of your questions during the webinar so we can do that in our Q&A slot. You can use the GoToWebinar toolbar menu at the side screen. Just click on questions and type it in there at any time. As a reminder, anyone registered for this webinar, even if they haven't been able to attend today, will receive the recording as well as the slide deck tomorrow. So let's get going, and I'll pass it over to Phil.
Thank you, Paul. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this exciting topic with my colleague Alex, Director of Analytics at the agency. To give some context, we're going to obviously bring to you the reason as to why GA4 should be on your radar and why this is an important topic for all digital marketing contributors. So what's happened is that Google is imposing this on us. Next July, they're sunsetting the current Universal Analytics version. So you'll need to, before then, set up a GA4 property, and the setup aspect and some of those best practices Alex will cover in our presentation today. Because as of July 1st, your UA properties will stop receiving new data. So this is something to consider. And in our practice of digital marketing and understanding the performance of the initiatives that we do for our clients, we often use year-over-year comparison. So the faster you set up your GA4 property, the faster you can actually take advantage of year-over-year data within the actual environment GA4. So before I pass over the mic to my colleague Alex, we will have a few polls that we'd like to launch, just to understand in this particular one, how often you currently go and review your data in Google Analytics. Never, occasionally, daily. We just want to get a sense of the audience that we have with us today. We'll give you a few more moments. I think the majority of you, I think we're almost there. And we ran the webinar earlier today. It'll be interesting to see. Yeah, so the bulk of you go in there once in a while or regularly. So that's good. The next poll we wanted to run is, do you actually have a GA4 property either created or fully configured? I'll give you some time to answer. Okay, I think we're good here. I'm going to close the poll in a moment here and share the results. So interestingly, earlier in the first question, many of you go into GA on a regular basis, but only about 30% of you have a, or are sure that they have a GA4 property that's configured or at least exists. And having it exist is the beginning of having the data accruing in the report. So that's the first step. And my colleague will talk about some of the configuration elements and also some of the reporting and insights you can draw from that. So thank you for sharing that pulse. It gives us a good idea. And Alex, I'll leave the floor over to you.
All right. So yeah, thanks for filling out those polls, everyone. I guess I'll just circle back to a bit of that first slide we looked at about GA, the classic version stopping on July 1st of the next summer. So one of the added complications of this, so GA, Universal Analytics, also called UA, is most likely the Google Analytics that your school has set up or had set up at some point just because it's been around for so long. So not only will it stop collecting new data next summer, but also all of the historical data that's in there will also become unavailable at some point. It hasn't been specified yet by Google, but it's definitely a bit of an extra impetus to start thinking about making the switch over to GA4, or if you have a lot of old reports, to start exporting those as CSVs if you want to keep some of that data on hand. And I guess the other important thing to note here is that GA4 will soon be the only, I guess, analytics solution proposed by Google in this sense. And as we'll see today, for those of you less familiar with it, it's a very different platform from UA. They're not compatible. You cannot just export all your old data into the new one. You can't just upgrade. It's actually a completely new platform that needs to be deployed. And so before we get to the actual deployment, we just want to talk about a few things, because we sometimes have in our conversations with admins at schools or administrators that they might not really understand the value of having Google Analytics, or what's the consequence of actually losing it. So beyond, if you're not one of the people that goes in there every day, or maybe it's just even occasionally, there's a few really, I guess, key things that you can get really only from your analytics account, as opposed to, say, your paid ads, dashboards, or other things like that. So notably, with no analytics, you'd lose a lot of demographics and geolocation on the visitors coming to your site. So for instance, you might know that you're getting some leads coming in, but you might not be knowing which countries they're coming from if you don't have that set up in a certain way. So that makes it kind of difficult to optimize or plan for future campaigns, particularly if you see a lot of interest from maybe a market or a demographic you hadn't considered. Your analytics can actually kind of shine some light on this. Also, it's really difficult to getting insight on how your inbound strategies are working, such as for content. So for instance, say you have a blogging strategy, if you don't have your analytics installed and installed correctly, you might not be able to see which pieces of content are attracting the most visitors. And in fact, it'll be harder to shape your roadmap as you go forward to know what's the best type of content to deploy. And lastly, the other reason it's really important is that today, more than ever, with such emphasis on the digital marketplace, most schools, yours included, probably use a lot of different channels when it comes to actually meeting your KPIs. So it wouldn't just be having your website. You probably also have one or two different paid ads accounts. Maybe you have some social media as well. Maybe you have other sites also sending you leads. So having analytics really lets you see how all these different parts work together and gives you the complete picture in your data and all the different parts of your larger marketing strategy. And so when we're talking also about adopting GA4, as Phil mentioned, it's really better to adopt this sooner rather than later. I mean, you could theoretically wait until the last day to do it, but honestly, there's a bunch of benefits for doing this early. The one that we've sort of hinted at so far is that the moment you deploy this new analytics platform, you'll start gathering data immediately. And so if you do that this month, you'll probably have 8 months or so of data by the time the switch happens later. So if you're still going to be using UA the whole time, at least this will be gathering historical data. So when the switch comes over, it won't be like it's a clean break beforehand with nothing to look at in the past. Also, if you're one of those people that uses Google Analytics daily, or at least routinely uses it on a monthly basis, because the interface is so different and the way it operates is so different, you're probably going to want a little bit of time to familiarize yourself with the new reports, including some reports that you might have to build as well. Because as we'll see in a little bit, a lot of the default reports from UA are not going to be available out of the box. You actually have to set up some yourselves. And I guess most importantly, because analytics is really helpful for understanding, measuring our KPIs, you honestly don't want to have a gap between, when you lose tracking, start tracking again, because that could be, a week before you get GA adopted later on. It could be a month. You honestly don't want to see these gaps in your data. So the next part of our webinar here, we're just going to give you a bit of a run through on how to set it up, but also how to make sure you maybe have it set up properly for when the switch comes. So the steps here, if they haven't been done yet, you could probably do them at your leisure before then, as long as you probably want to consider doing this sooner rather than later. So fortunately, getting yourself a GA4 account, if you do not have one, is actually very easy right now. If you have a UA account, so a standard GA account, you can actually just go into your admin section, which looks like a little cog at the bottom left of the main screen. And in there, you'll find the properties tab, which has create property. So at present, the only type of property you can create is a GA4 one, which makes it very convenient. It's just a couple clicks and it starts the process for you. In the past, if you had looked at it, you might have seen there's a few options there. It was a little bit more confusing, but I think about the past month or so, it's been much more streamlined. It's very simple to set up. And of course, if you don't have any analytics or you're not really sure what you have, you can always just go to analytics.google.com and either sign in with a Google account or sign up for the service from there. And by default, if you do not have one, it will start the creation process for a GA4 account. UA will not be able to be created anymore at this point. So one of the things that I suspect a lot of people might not notice is the first time when you set up your GA4 account, you have to do a little bit of connecting in it. Notably, you have to connect at least one data stream to this. So a data stream is just a source or a site that you want to track. 9 times out of 10, this is just going to be your website. So you put your website in there, the name of the site, you create the stream, and it would start being able to pull the data in from there. Some cases, you might have a secondary website. For instance, all subdomains get included in here, but if you have a completely different domain that you also want to bring in, you might need to create a second data stream. Or if you're one of the larger schools that has like a cell phone application or anything like that, you can create separate streams for those as well to bring all the data from your different sites into one GA account. When you're also setting this up, one of the things we recommend everybody does is also filter out your internal IP addresses. So this could be any of your administrators who are on all day, your web development team. It could be if your registrar uses the back end of the site to manage students. You might have all this extra traffic kind of muddying the waters a little bit in your data. So ideally what you want to do is get their IP addresses, which you can usually easily do through Google. Just, find my IP, what's my IP, things like that. And then you'll put those in here and you can filter those out. You can filter up to 10 IP addresses. So if you have some people working remotely, you can also filter them out. And really just to make sure the data that you have in here is just focused on your prospective students and the students visiting your website, and you don't need to worry about its accuracy as much. And now that you've had like the base set up, you still have to deploy this on your website. There's a few ways you can do this. I mean, in some cases, it might just be you asking your web developer to give you a hand, but you can also do it yourself relatively easily in a sense. If you go into your property settings, you really just need your property ID. And from there, the method that we recommend the most is using another Google tool called Google Tag Manager, or GTM. That's effectively, it's a platform where you can quickly and relatively easily deploy tracking tags to your website. It minimizes the code, so it's a bit cleaner, less chances of them sort of getting muddled and conflicting with each other. It's a really useful tool. And the benefit here is that it's also a Google product, so it really gels well with GA4. And there's a pre-made tag for Google Analytics 4. You just go find it, you create it, you add your ID number, and you tell it to fire on all pages, and then you submit and deploy, and now you're ready to be collecting all of your data, at least the base data, on GA4. And so in this following section, so now that we're assuming you have a GA4 setup, we'll talk a little bit about how to use the platform, some of the data you can get out of there, but really focusing on your KPIs and your KPI reporting. So as an analytics platform, Google collects lots of information, like what pages are being visited, how many visitors coming in on certain days and so forth. But really, probably the most important thing about this, as we talked about, is how you can really see all of your different channels, all of your different marketing efforts, how it all comes into play in terms of generating success for your enrollment campaigns. So that's what we'll try to focus on over here. Before I get to some of the specifics though, this is maybe a heads up for people that are a bit more familiar with UA, the older version of Google. As I mentioned before, a lot of it has changed. So for instance, this is just some snapshots of the earlier version of Google's menus. Notably, there's a lot of menu options, a lot of drop downs. When you open one option, then more drop downs below that. So the previous version of Google had lots and lots of reports that were pre-built. There's like literally dozens of these. If you're somebody who uses it very frequently, you probably like that you can find your way to the one you wanted. But if you're new to it and don't use it often, it's probably a little bit confusing. So in GA4, one of the things that's nice is that it's a much sleeker menu. There's fewer options, there's fewer drop downs, and it really just gets you to the reports a lot quicker, and you get a lot more information at a glance. And in some ways, it's also, there's more reports that are focused directly on your conversions and your KPIs now. So before you can actually monitor any of your KPIs in GA4, you're going to have to set them up. And this process is actually very different from the way it was back in UA. So if you've looked at Google Analytics reports in the past, if you've done some work in there yourself, you probably know something called goals, which is usually how we would set different KPI to be tracked in Google Analytics. So goals are fairly simple. You'd often just list a page where this would take place. So, you know, if you fill in a form to become a lead, it sends it to a thank you page, and that would be your goal. And, you know, just set a few of those up, and there wasn't much to it. So goals no longer exist in GA4. Everything now is event-based. And so what is an event? An event is any sort of action that takes place on your site by a visitor. So there's some mundane events such as clicks, you know, time on page, using the scroll bar, things like that. But also you're going to want to build some custom events, in this case conversion events, that'll be tracking your main KPIs and things that really matter towards your business, such as how many students filled out a form to become a lead, how many students have clicked the button to call the registrar's office or the admissions team, and so forth, how many have downloaded a brochure. So these are things you're definitely going to want to set up ideally earlier rather than later, because at least if they're set up, you can start collecting this data even if you're not looking at it, and then next year you can look over some year-to-year comparisons. So setting up is also a very different process from what it was in UA. It's honestly a little bit more complicated now. You might need to look at some references from Google about what sort of parameters to put in when you're creating a new event. Like for instance, this one here is just a sample of what the creation process looks like if you're wanting to set up an event for, say, a student hits your website, they have to fill in a form to then receive the brochure. So you would need to create some sort of brochure download event. And here, under the conditions of what this event is, it means it's when somebody views a page, but the specific page is the one, the thank you page for the brochure, and then you would have to actually mark that as a conversion as opposed to one of the more normal events. So it's a little bit trickier, but it's one of the things that once you get the hang of it, it becomes a bit easier, especially if you have a lot of KPIs. You'll probably want to set all these up as soon as possible. Fortunately, when you're working on setting up your KPIs, there's actually some things you can do to troubleshoot them, which is really nice, which ties well into one of these sort of improved features of GA4. So back in UA, there was a real-time report, but I don't know how many people honestly looked at it. It might have been a bit more, you know, secondhand or like afterthought, but it's very prominent now in GA4, and it's one of the tools that we use a lot in our own teams when we're troubleshooting and trying to set up events. So what the real-time report does is it shows you everybody who's on your site at a moment, but also at a glance you get to see all the activities and actions, and in other words, the events that are taking place. So who's clicking what are they doing, and so forth. And you can also use this to troubleshoot to see if your conversion events are firing. So maybe you can have a colleague in a different browser go on, test the form that you just set up, and on this page, if it's working correctly, you'll actually see that event take place moving down the little timeline here. So it's a really good way to actually make sure things are set up and working, because sometimes with GA4, it's not always clear if you set something up properly. You might notice maybe a week later that there's been no leads coming in according to this, but you have a whole bunch in your CRM. So this is really the best way of checking right off the bat to make sure things are indeed functioning. So once you have all of your KPIs, you know, your markers set up, what you can do is we're going to show you there's a lot of different information you can get on these, a lot of different ways to look into what's taking place, you know, and how your overall site is performing. So probably one of the first stops you'd want to do is the conversion report, which is under the engagements section of the main list. And here it shows you all the different conversion events that have been reported during the set time period, which is usually the last 30 days. And we can see in the sample here of the 5 different conversion events we have, you know, we have 158 for this particular landing page request info form. There's some other request info forms. We have a number coming in there, calls to click, in this case, probably for the admissions office. And so we can see that we're getting a whole bunch of these tracked. So we can see the numbers. You can always use this to try to compare to your internal numbers as well. But realistically, this might not be all you want to understand about your data. So we can certainly go a bit further. We have an advertising snapshot report. And this one isn't a bit better because in a sense, we still see the amount of conversion we're getting, but here it shows it by which channel is bringing in these students or prospective students who are converting. So right here, we see that organic search is the main driver, followed by email and then direct. And so we can look at this to see which channels are the ones that are being attributed all these conversion actions.
Yeah. In terms of channels, just to maybe provide some context to our audience, those are the different sources. Google has organized these sources into lumped or rolled up initiatives. For example, organic search are all the search engines. So you can have Google, you'll have Bing, you'll have Yahoo, you'll have others, and they group them together. In terms of email marketing, if you're doing email marketing and you're tagging your links, because maybe you're using MailChimp or a CRM system, and that system is tagging them for you, anytime a user comes back to your website or to a page that's being tagged with your GA4 property, that activity will be attributed to email. And I bring this up because shortly, Alex will talk about some of the relationships and how your channels work together to generate those conversions, which we've talked about significantly today. And in our sector, in the education sector, there are common ones, lead generation, CTAs, or calls to action, application calls to action. So we want to understand the relationship and the performance of those channels or sources towards those conversion events. So understanding what the channels are, whether they're referrals coming from other websites to you, whether you have people that are coming directly to your site, that's because they've bookmarked it, or there's organic social. Actually, GA4 has improved the visibility on the channel attribution, and also has created some new channels. So I just wanted to provide a bit more context to this, Alex. So over to you.
Okay, thanks, Phil. Yeah, we'll definitely talk a bit more about channels in a minute or two, but I want to highlight something here as well, which is one of the neat features of GA4 that we can see here. So on the side over here, we actually have a little panel that says Insight. So this is actually something from Google's AI that it's discovering in the data. So periodically, you'll get to see a little bit of these popping up, not just here, but other parts of the GA4 dashboard. And it could be things that maybe you never thought about or didn't notice just from looking at the data at a glance. So for instance, right here, one of these first ones it did is it points out that organic was driving the most conversions at 44% total, but also that where there was higher than expected engagement for people with UK English as their browser, 126% more than it was predicted probably from the previous month. So sometimes some of these will be a bit more, I guess, eye-openers. So it's always good to go and check what Google's AI is picking out from there, because it might be things you weren't expecting. So returning to what this discussion about channels and which channels are driving conversions, important thing to understand is what it counts as a conversion, or why it's giving a conversion to one channel over another. This is what's going to turn us towards attribution models. So that's really just a fancy way of talking about how a conversion is awarded to a particular source. So say you have 10 conversions by email, the attribution model will explain to us why we're saying 10 came from email and not from organic. And so some of the ways these models work, so last click, which is pretty much the predominantly used one for most of marketing, means the last channel or source that a user interacted with gets awarded 100% of the conversion. So what this would do, so say a student visits your site by organic traffic, they sign up for your newsletter, they come in through the newsletter and become a lead that way. It'll just be that final source of maybe the newsletter email that counts it, and you won't have these other earlier steps within it. So things like first click, on the other hand, really put a lot of priority on the very first way a student or prospective student discovered your content. So say they saw a branded ad somewhere, they clicked it, didn't do anything for a few days, but then they interacted with your Facebook page and then finally came and became a lead, they would attribute that to the very first thing they saw. So in this case, the branded ad. So some of the other models aren't used as often, but for instance, linear attributes everything equally. So if they touch 4 different parts of your content, they'll all be awarded parts of the conversion. Position-based, it puts more importance on the first thing that brought them to the site as well as the last thing before they converted. Time decay gives more importance the closer it gets to conversion, and data-driven is mostly AI-backed, where it tries to interpret what students did at different parts of this journey and where the most important part of it was overall.
Before you move to the next slide, Alex, I just want to add one comment. These models, depending on your scale and the resources you invest in digital marketing, specifically paid advertising or organic search or email for that matter. Depending on the scale, they'll become more or less important. But GA4 is really putting this in the forefront, and Alex will show some reports highlighting the nuances when you can compare models. So one advice we'd want to give you is that as you start playing with it and get familiar with it, you need to decide what model you'll stick with. And because if you change mid-course, the model you're using as a benchmarking tool, it's going to impact how you're providing credit to the different channels that you're using. The other thing I should say is that we're really in a multi-channel world when it comes to student recruitment. It's not just Google ads or just Facebook ads or just my website. They're really working together. So you'll want to spend some time on the model and the analysis to understand how these different initiatives work together. And GA4 is doing a good job there to help you get to that answer. Over to you.
Yes, absolutely. I guess to touch on that, I guess historically, a lot of the way people have been kind of trained to look at marketing data and your KPIs inside of like Google Analytics is often to have a sort of siloed vision that, you know, email doesn't touch anything else, paid ads doesn't touch anything else, it's just paid ads. But realistically, your users are finding you all over the web in different ways, different touch points. They've probably visited your Facebook site, they've maybe seen your Twitter account if you have that, they've clicked on some of your ads, they found your blogs, and so forth. And using these different attribution models is really a good way to get the holistic picture of how all these work together at a glance. So one of the reports just wanted to highlight here is under the advertising snapshot, you can actually have a comparison between different attribution models. So for instance, on the left here, we have the traditional last click model. On the right, we put the first click just to see some differences. So what's interesting, even though there's not a lot of differences here, if you're looking at first click, we can see that organic search actually brought in 2 other people as the first contact with your content and your website, who then, you know, went to a different mean afterwards. So sometimes you might see really interesting things here, such as maybe the way you have your website organized is that most students will get an email and they would maybe register through that email. So you might see 100% of your last clicks attributed to email. But if you look at first click, maybe you're gonna see 33% came from your branded campaign on Google, another 33% from your Facebook posts and so forth. So it's really good to see that different types of your marketing strategy interact differently and might play different roles in this larger process of getting a prospect to become a lead or even a student at your school. And as Phil was saying, there's some really good data here, right side the gate inside GA4 to really let you see how a lot of your different channels, your different endeavors, and your campaigns all work together. So this report under the conversion paths of advertising, it shows you at a glance how different channels and touch points sort of form a larger picture of who becomes a conversion. So in this case, some of these are very easiest, they're kind of singular. For instance, paid search, people using only paid search, 60 conversions came out of there, only direct, 57. But then we start to see some interesting things like organic and referral. So these are people that probably Googled your website, maybe they landed on your blog, landed on a program page, and then they went probably to your Facebook page, and then from there came back, and then that's how they became, you know, a lead in your system. So if you only had it on just last click single channel, you would not have seen this sort of larger journey that takes place. And when you have, I guess, more ambitious marketing plans and larger sites and all that, you're going to see some very complex patterns in here. You know, somebody might hit 5 or 6 different touch points of different channels or different campaigns before becoming a student or even a lead in this case. And an interesting thing here, we can actually drill down even further if you have this, if your GA4 is connected to your Google ads and your Facebook campaigns and other paid ad campaigns are tagged properly, you can actually filter by campaign and see your individual campaign names and how they played part of this journey. And sometimes you'll see some interesting things here that might be worth reminding yourself. So in the previous one, we saw how paid ads was responsible for 60 conversions. But we see here, there's not a lot of just single paid ads. So what it looks like is paid ads played a part where maybe multiple paid ads were part of this process. So for instance, here on row number 8, we see the cybersecurity campaign here, and it was interacted with twice. So that tells us that these users in particular saw the ad twice before they actually ended up converting. Sometimes you might interact with multiple different ads and so forth before they finally become that conversion. So things like this are really useful for looking beyond maybe just the surface values of how many people are becoming leads, but really seeing how all of your different efforts work together. Because as Phil said, this is very much a multi-channel world we're in. Very few, I guess, campaigns or assets you might have online are actually off in their own silo and don't connect with others. But people are, it's a bit about their habits today. They're looking all over the place for courses, finding your content all over the place as well. So it's not just your website, but all these other places that you can be found, which work together to drive these conversions. And so if all these different reports we sort of talked about and showing you some of the ways to get deeper into your data aren't everything that you need, maybe there's some reports from the old UA that relied on, maybe there's some internal reports that you use that you like to look up. GA4 has this advanced or maybe intermediary feature called explorations, which basically lets you build your own reports. So it's a bit of, you can pick a lot of different options in here. You can pick segments, like which users do you want to look at. You can pick dimensions like the countries they're from, what metrics you want to count, and you can do quite a little bit here to kind of make any sort of report you're looking for. And just to give you maybe more of a concrete example is in this report that I put together. So I sampled 3 countries, so traffic or visitors from Canada, USA, the United Kingdom, and I wanted to look at what events they took part in or what events they did on the website, but particularly I just want to see the conversions. And so when I plug all this together, I get to have this report that lets me see which conversions, or not, sorry, how many conversions are taking place from visitors per country, but also which conversions. So you can see some interesting data in this report I built that, for instance, Canada has a large number of people call to clicks, which are probably, a calls to admissions in office. And USA, while it has fewer, it has a lot of people filling out this sort of lead form that's at the top one there. So you can see that prospects from different countries even act differently, which could give you a bit more insight into your overall marketing strategies.
Yeah, the important element to highlight perhaps on this screen, Alex, for our viewers today is that what's obviously the UX on the left-hand side of the report is the interface that you use to build the report on the right. The part that's a bit challenging at the beginning is to know the taxonomy. And the taxonomy is not exactly how it is in UA. So there are some nuances. You have to understand what a segment is, a dimension, a metric, what are the things you're trying to measure. So that's where there's might be a learning curve, whereas the old UA, the current UA, the older one, has a whole bunch of reports that are all pre-cooked for you that all you have to do is go and click around and you'd get all kinds of answers. And you can add a secondary dimension, whereas here, you have to determine what you want to know and how it's called. So you'll have to play with this to understand what to get out of it. So if you have any questions for us, Alex and I are at your disposal. We have a couple of things we want to maybe highlight. One question we had was, can I import my UA data into GA4? And at the moment, without saying a blunt no, all the information we have online is how to export UA data to kind of preserve it elsewhere, whether it's in a CSV file or Excel or BigQuery or whichever. So it's telling you how to export it, but there's no import path, and we don't think that's going to become available because of the technology is so different. It's not compatible. As you have your property of GA4 and your UA view and you start comparing your data, you'll see the numbers are different because it's not measuring things the same way. So we recommend do it sooner than later so that you can really stabilize your environment, understand what it is you want to measure, and then start comparing and assess the information. As I said earlier, year-over-year comparison we use on a regular basis. So if you want to have that sooner than later, setting up your GA4 property, at least the basic setup, we'd recommend doing it immediately for those that don't have if it hit at the moment. The real-time report that Alex highlighted is really, really cool and very useful, especially if you're trying to launch new things and you want to see if they're being reported properly. So the real-time report, we recommend that you spend time there. Then what we saw was that there are new channels being defined, like cross-network, specifically around Performance Max campaigns or DV360 initiatives. There's now you saw organic, social, there's paid organic. There's more visibility out of the box, which is really interesting and is going to make our marketers' lives a bit more, not easier, but a bit more granular in terms of the visibility. And lastly, the whole notion of attribution and comparison, I find it personally very fascinating. And we are in a world today where we're trying to do things in different platforms, and there's more and more platforms being launched. We be on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Google, Bing, LinkedIn, and all of the others. So how are they playing together to yield those conversions? That's really fascinating, and we'd encourage you to spend some time there. So for those of you, we're going to be having more webinars on this topic on the fall and the winter. We also have some academy courses. So for those of you that want to do it themselves, we have some training that Alex and I will be providing you in the fall. So you're welcome to go to our website, highereducationmarketing.com/academy to see the start dates. And if you need our help to assess the setup of your property, or you want us to do it for you, or determine if there's best practices that you're not following, by all means, please reach out to us. I think you have a contact slide, Alex, you can share with the audience. So our colleagues, Scott and Lara, and obviously myself, we're at your disposal. You can reach out to us, and we're here to help if there's anything you need. Let's see if there's any other questions we have to answer. No, unless any other questions come up, we want to highlight that we'll be sharing the slides in the recording. We thank you for the attendance and participation. And I know that some of this stuff could be technical and sometimes over our head, but it's really, really important. And more so now that we are in a cookie-less environment, more and more users are trying to opt out of being tracked. So these technologies will help you assess the performance of your digital marketing initiatives. Alex, thank you for the presentation and participation. Pleasure. And thank you everyone for joining us. Have a good day. Thank you.
Have a good one.